The first time I saw her, she was eating out of a dumpster behind the transit depot on Platform 9. I almost walked past. I'd been working a double shift at the maintenance bay, my knuckles were cracked from cold grease, and the kind of tired I carried wasn't the kind sleep fixed. I had 2 blocks to go before I could fall face first into my cot and stop existing for a few hours, and the wind off the transit tunnels had teeth, and I'd already convinced myself that whatever small sound had snagged my attention was nothing. A strut settling, a pressure vent releasing, the ordinary acoustic clutter of a transit district after midnight. But I stopped, I don't know exactly why. Maybe the sound she made, which was not quite crying and not quite not, a small, high noise like a wire pulled too tight, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to machinery. Maybe just the habit of 7 years in maintenance, where you learn that the small, unexpected noise is always worth checking, because the small, unexpected noise is how major failures begin. She was wedged between the waste compactor and the outer wall of the depot, a gap no adult could have fit into, and she was maybe 3 feet tall and trembling so hard her whole body seemed to flicker at its edges like a signal going in and out of range. Her skin was the pale silver gray of new ice caught under depot lighting, and her ears came to fine points at the tips, and her eyes, when she looked up at me from that tight space, were the color of deep water lit from far below. Teal, nearly luminous, enormous in her small face. She had a half-eaten synth-grain bar held in both hands, and she froze the moment she saw me. Not just stopped moving. Froze completely. No breathing that I could see, no blinking, everything locked while she calculated whether I was a threat and what direction escape would require. I crouched down. My knees ached, they always did after a double shift, after years of crouching in maintenance crawlways. I held my hands out, palms up slowly, the way you do when you want something frightened to understand that your hands are empty, and you know it, and you're making sure it can see. "Hey," I said, "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't speak, just looked at me with those underwater eyes, looking at my hands, looking at my face, the calculation still running. I looked at the synth-grain bar, looked at her, looked at the way her ribs showed faintly through the thin fabric of what she was wearing, not clothes exactly, more like a garment that had once been very fine and had since been destroyed by time and weather and desperation. Silver thread still caught the depot lights in certain places. A crest of some kind, barely visible now at the collar, embroidered with care. Something official, something that had mattered to someone. "You got somewhere to be?" I asked. "Nothing." I reached slowly into my jacket, she flinched, a small, involuntary backward press into the narrow space, and pulled out the sandwich I'd bought for the walk home. Synthetic chicken, the kind that didn't taste much like chicken but at least had the right texture. I set it on the ground between us at the edge of the space where she was hiding. Then I backed off a step. It took her 11 seconds. I counted, watching her eyes move between my face and the sandwich and the distance between herself and the space beyond the gap. 11 seconds of calculation, and then a small silver-gray hand reached out and took it. Her name was not something my mouth could reproduce correctly. I discovered this over several patient weeks of trying. The sounds the Varathi used in their names were made in places human throats didn't naturally reach, and the closest I could come, after sustained effort that made her watch me with the expression of a music teacher listening to a student with no ear, was something like Sil, a brightness at the front of the mouth. She looked at me when I said it, and then she looked away with the compressed expression of someone who has accepted a limitation they'd rather not have to accept. "Sil," I tried again. She made a small sound that I learned over time was Varathi for approximately close enough. I called her Sil. She allowed it with the grave tolerance of a small being who understood that human mouths have ceilings, and it was ungracious to stand below one and complain. She let me take her home that first night because she had nowhere else to go, and I think she knew that I knew that, and I think she appreciated, in the way a creature that has been surviving on its own resources appreciates anything, that I didn't use it as leverage. I gave her the couch. I gave her every blanket I owned, which was 4, which barely covered her when she curled up small. I stood in the doorway of my one-room apartment on the 8th level of the Harkin residential block and looked at her looking back at me from the couch, wary, watchful, wound tight even under all those blankets, and I said, "You're safe here." I meant it. I made sure my voice knew I meant it. Something in her unwound a fraction. Not much, a fraction, but I'd take fractions. By morning she had cataloged every item in my apartment. I know this because when I woke up she was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the center of the room, and every object I owned had been arranged in concentric circles around her, laid out with a precision that would have done credit to an inventory technician, and she was examining each item in turn with an intensity so focused it made her look years older than she was. My hand tools, organized by type and size. My spare reader tablets. The power cells for the work lamp. A deck of physical cards a former coworker had given me as a joke gift. The photograph of my mother. The coffee mug with a chip in the handle that my sister had given me 11 years ago, and that I had kept without examination every time I'd moved since. The way you keep certain things, because putting them down would require admitting something you're not ready to admit. She held the mug in both hands and looked up at me. "That's mine," I said. She set it down precisely where she'd found it. Then she picked up the photograph. She held it carefully, both hands, the same care she'd given the mug, and she studied it. The woman in the photograph had my coloring and my mouth, and was standing in a garden in a way that suggested she'd been trying to water something when someone pointed a camera at her, and she turned and laughed because she couldn't help it. A person lit from inside, my mother. Some people have that quality, most don't. Syl looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she set it down very gently, and her face did something complicated, and she looked away at the wall. I didn't push. I made coffee, the real kind, ground from actual beans, my one consistent luxury, the thing I bought even when I shouldn't, and I poured her a cup and set it in front of her and stepped back, and she sniffed it for approximately 2 full minutes before drinking half of it in a single go, and then making a face that I can only describe as the face of someone who has been personally misled by a beverage. I laughed. It surprised me, the laugh. I hadn't done much of it lately. She looked at me sharply, the betrayed expression shifting into something uncertain, and then into something that unclenched around the edges, and then she made a sound that I was almost entirely sure was a laugh too, though it came from a different place in the throat and landed differently, like a similar word in a different language. That was day 2. I didn't look into who she was right away. I know how that sounds, but there is a logic to it that I want to lay out, because it wasn't avoidance and it wasn't irresponsibility, and it wasn't me deciding her situation was none of my business. It was the opposite. She was hiding. That much was obvious before I got her home. The deliberate concealment in the gap, the way she'd assessed me for 11 full seconds, the state of what she was wearing, all of that spoke to a small creature who had been staying out of sight on purpose, and for reasons that felt to her like survival reasons. Whatever she'd come from it hard and fast and without resources. The wrong question from the wrong stranger at the wrong time sends a frightened thing running, and a frightened thing running on platform 9 has nowhere to go but into traffic, or into the cold, or back into whatever it was hiding from. So I waited. I kept her fed, which turned out to be a more significant project than I'd expected because Varathi metabolism runs faster than human, and she needed more calories per body weight, and her nutritional requirements overlapped with human requirements but not completely, and I spent 3 evenings researching this on my reader tablet while she slept and making adjustments to what I bought. I got it mostly right by the end of the first week, I think. She stopped looking quite so thin by the end of the second. She came to the maintenance bay with me on days when I couldn't leave her alone in the apartment. I didn't see another option. There was no one to leave her with, and leaving a child alone in a small apartment while you worked a 10-hour shift is not something I was willing to do regardless of the other circumstances. My supervisor, a broad-shouldered woman named Callista who had been in maintenance longer than I'd been alive and who asked very few questions as a professional discipline, took one look at Syl sitting in the corner of Bay 7 with her knees pulled up and her enormous teal eyes tracking everything and said, "The corner is fine. Don't let her touch the live relays." That was the whole conversation. Syl sat in the corner of the bay and watched me work. I became aware of it after the first hour, the way her attention moved with my hands rather than with me, the way she was tracking procedure rather than person. She wasn't watching me. She was watching the work, learning the work, testing what she was learning against what I did next. After 2 weeks, she started handing me tools before I asked for them. Not always, not every time, but enough times that it was clearly not coincidence. She was anticipating the next step in a procedure she had observed me perform multiple times, and she was offering the correct tool for that step, and she was right more often than not. The first time she handed me the calibration wrench exactly when I needed it, I said nothing, just took it, and then I looked over at her, and she was looking at the machine with an expression of focused satisfaction that I recognized as the expression of someone who has confirmed a hypothesis. She was 6 years old. She had been eating out of a dumpster a week ago. I taught her words in the evenings. She learned them faster than I expected and then faster than that, and the rate kept increasing, which made me suspect the first few days had been not slow learning but deliberate pacing, deciding whether I was worth learning from, testing the returns before investing the full capacity. By the end of the first week, she had around 200 words and was using them in sentences that had correct grammar even when they were surprising. "The fixing is done and the machine is satisfied now," she told me one afternoon, handing back a wrench. I looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," I said, "I think you're right." She smiled. It was a careful thing, that first smile, offered with the precision of someone who had decided to give something and wanted to make sure it was received correctly. It was received correctly. In the evenings, I started learning her language in return. She taught me with a patience that should not have been possible in a 6-year-old, and that I eventually attributed not to natural patience, but to a high tolerance for necessary processes. She was not patient exactly. She was thorough. Every mistake was corrected without frustration, every sound repeated as many times as I needed it repeated, every error noted and addressed and then set aside without dwelling. She maintained, throughout these sessions, the expression of a music teacher who has accepted the limitations of the instrument and chosen to work within them. Some evenings she fell asleep during lessons. Her head would tip forward and catch itself and tip forward again, and I'd put a hand on her shoulder and say her name and she'd blink at me with eyes gone unfocused, and I'd say, "That's enough for tonight," and she'd look at me for a moment with the expression of someone who wants to argue, but has already lost the argument to their own exhaustion. Then she'd curl up under her blankets on the couch and sleep with the complete, trustful stillness of someone who has decided, provisionally, that the space therein is safe enough to let go. I sat in the chair across the room on those nights, and I listened to her breathe, and I thought about what she was and what had happened to her, and what I was supposed to do about it. I found the crest on the 14th day. She was washing up and had left the garment on the chair, and I picked it up to fold it, and the overhead light caught the embroidery at the collar, and I looked at it, really looked at it for the first time. I know enough about the Varathi Collective to work in a transit district that serves diplomatic traffic. You pick things up over years at the maintenance bay, sigil structures, rank conventions, the way official marks are distinguished from decorative ones. The crest at her collar was not decorative. It was official, and it was not a minor house's mark. I'd seen it before on diplomatic correspondence that routed through my administrative terminal during the months I'd handled the Bay's data management. I'd seen it on broadcasts, the Empress's house, the primary bloodline of the Varathi collective. I put the garment down. I sat with that information in the kitchen for a while, drinking cold coffee and looking at the wall. Syl was still in the bathroom. I could hear the sound of the water running. A child of the Empress's house, alone and starving and hiding on Platform 9. There are only so many explanations for that situation, and most of them are bad. Children don't end up in dumpsters on transit platforms because of administrative oversights or minor miscommunications. Children end up there because something has gone wrong that is larger than a child and more deliberate than an accident. I didn't say anything to her that night. I made dinner and she ate everything and some of mine, and we did our language lesson, and she fell asleep on the couch. I sat in the chair and I looked at her and I thought, someone knows where she is or someone doesn't, and either way I am in this situation now, and I should think about how to handle it carefully. Over the next week, I watched the public communication channels from the maintenance bay's broadcast terminals. I'd always had access to those feeds for work, routing, coordination, interdependence of systems across the district. Now I paid attention to a different layer. There was nothing obvious, no public missing child alert, no named search, nothing that described her or used her name. The Varathi diplomatic bands were quiet on the subject. But there was a pattern in things that were not about her. 3 Varathi diplomatic missions in this district over the past 4 months, 2 trade delegations, 1 cultural exchange. None of them had produced any visible outcomes. No trade agreements filed, no cultural events documented, no follow-on communications. All 3 had spent the majority of their time in residential and transit zones rather than the diplomatic quarter, which was not where delegations went if they were doing what they said they were doing. Someone was looking, quietly, which meant whoever was looking had reason to believe that the official channels were not safe to use. The same reason, presumably, that she was in a dumpster rather than an embassy terminal. I came home on a Thursday evening 4 weeks into her stay, and she was sitting at my table with the old reader tablet open, and she had found the Varathi archive access point and worked out how to navigate it, which told me her technical capabilities were considerably higher than she'd indicated. She was reading with her whole body rigid, and her face very still in the way I'd learned meant she was working hard to keep it that way. When she heard me come in, she closed the file. But not before I saw what she'd been reading. A memorial record, Varathi Royal House. The entry read in the Varathi script I was still working my way through, in memory of the daughter of our Empress. 3 years ago, she had been officially listed as dead. She was looking at me when I looked up from the screen. In her eyes, fear, yes, but under it and behind it and larger than it, something else. A terrible hope, the kind that has been crushed before and knows it and hopes anyway because it cannot help itself. I pulled the other chair out and sat down across from her. "Syl," I said. She held still. "How old are you?" She held up 7 fingers, thought about it, put one down. 6, I said. She nodded. "And 3 years ago," I said carefully, like I was working a loose connection back into its fitting, "where were you?" The silence lasted long enough that I thought she might not answer. I didn't push it. I'd learned she answered in her own time or not at all, and pushing produced either silence or something deliberately incomplete. Then she said, in her careful English, "A place I do not like to remember, but I remember every day." "You were taken," I said, not a question. She looked at the table, her jaw worked. "There were people who said they were from the court, who said my mother sent them, who said there was a situation that required quiet movement." She paused. "I was 3. I did not know to be more suspicious." "Of course you didn't." "I should have." You were 3, I said. Don't do that. She looked up, her face doing the complicated thing again. What happened to them? I asked. The people who took you. I do not know. At some point I was no longer with them. There were, she stopped, looked for words. Several transfers. Each time I was with different people. At some point I understood that no one was going to do what they said they were going to do, so I stopped listening to what they said and started watching what they did. She looked at her hands. And then I stopped being somewhere they could find me. She was 6 years old. She had been managing her own survival for at least a year, possibly more. On Platform 9, which is not a gentle place. Okay, I said, and I said it in the voice I'd have used if she'd handed me a very delicate component that I needed to set down without jarring it. Okay. The memorial, she said, they listed me as dead. I saw. Which means either my mother believes I am dead, or someone wanted her to believe it, and they're not the same thing. She looked at me. The missions, she said, the ones to this district. So she'd been watching the channels too. I shouldn't have been surprised. Yeah, I said. She's been looking, Syl said very quietly. I think so. Her face did something that was not quite an expression. It was what happens under an expression, the structural movement that expressions sit on top of. Then she said, "Do you want to go home?" I meant to ask her that. She'd gotten there first. I do not know, she said, if home still wants me. I think home has been looking for you for 3 years. They listed me as dead. Because they thought you were, or because someone made them think so. Or because they decided it was easier. Her voice was very flat when she said it. I looked at her. At the flat voice and the careful face and the 6-year-old body holding a year or more of survival experience in its posture. Is that what you think? I asked. She looked at the table for a long time. Then, no. But I have thought it. When things were very bad, it is easier to think that she gave up than to think she tried and failed. She paused. Because if she tried and failed, then she is sad, and I have spent a lot of time not wanting to think about her being sad. I sat with that. There wasn't much to say to it that wasn't either hollow or presumptuous. The missions, I said finally, quiet ones, no official outcomes. That's not what you do if you've given up. She was quiet. That's what you do, I said, if you're looking in places you can't look officially, because you're not sure who's safe. She lifted her face, those deep-water eyes very bright. Okay, I said, so we have to be careful about how we do this. She looked at me. Wait. I'm not dropping you at an embassy terminal and hoping for the best. Something in her face shifted, like a support structure taking weight and deciding it could hold it. You do not have to. I know. It might be complicated. Yeah, probably. You are a maintenance worker, she said, in a tone that was not dismissive but was trying to be practical. You did not sign up for. No, I agreed. I picked up a sandwich and it turned into 7 weeks and here we are. She looked at me, the deciding expression, the one I'd been watching for weeks, the one that meant she was running a full assessment rather than a surface read. Then she nodded. Okay, she said, we. It took another 3 weeks to do it right, because doing it right required doing it slowly. I cashed in favors across the transit network. 7 years in maintenance builds a particular kind of capital, not financial, not prestigious, but real. You fix things for people. You cover shifts. You know which systems talk to which systems and where the seams are. People remember the quiet, solid reliability of someone who showed up when they said they would and fixed what they said they'd fix and didn't make it dramatic. Darice worked the private docking registry on the upper transit levels. She owed me 2 years of favors for the months I'd covered her shifts when her father was dying, and she couldn't be in the district every day, and she had never once asked me why I was doing it, and I had never offered a reason because reasons weren't the point. I went to her now, and I asked for the Varathi private docking schedule. specifically the vessel that had arrived 3 weeks ago with the cultural exchange mission, and that had so far produced no visible culture being exchanged. She looked at me for a moment. Then she pulled up the registry and wrote a bay number and a schedule on a piece of actual paper, not a data transfer paper, and slid it across the counter, and she said, "Whatever this is, be careful." "I'm always careful," I said. "You are careful with machines," she said. "Be careful with people too." I took the paper and thanked her and went to the bay. I spent 2 days watching. The ship was a mid-sized diplomatic runner, unremarkable from the outside, which meant it was either actually unremarkable or trying to look it. I watched the crew rotations, the access patterns, who came down to the public level and when and for how long and what they did while they were there. I was looking for someone who searched without being seen to search. Someone who moved through public spaces the way you move when you're hoping to see something that will come to you rather than going actively to look for it. Because you can't go actively look for it without announcing that you're looking. I found her on the second morning. She stood at the edge of the bay's public access level, at the rail that overlooked the transit district below, for 11 minutes. Tall, Varathi tall, which put her 6 inches over me, with silver-white hair that caught the dock lighting and deep-set eyes that moved over everything and settled on nothing, traveling the district below with the steady, methodical sweep of someone who has been looking for so long that looking has become its own kind of rest. Not hope, exactly. Not hopelessness either. The exhausted middle territory that lives between them when you've been in it long enough. She was wearing a plain traveler's coat. Nothing on it that marked rank or origin, but her posture marked it, even standing at a public rail, even in borrowed plainness. She held herself in a way that said she was accustomed to being the point around which other things organized. She turned and I got a clear view of her face. I'd seen it before, on the diplomatic archives, on the broadcast feeds. Older now than the official portraits, harder in some places, softer in others, carrying a particular kind of shadow in the areas around the eyes that official portraits are not designed to show, but the same face. The Empress. She was here herself. I came home and told Sil. The silence was very long. She sat on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest and her chin resting on her knees, and she looked at the wall, and I let the silence go until it was ready to end. "She came herself," Sil said. "Yes." "In a plain coat." "Yes." "She's been there a while," Sil said, "not just now. The pattern suggests since the first mission, 4 months. Another silence. "She thinks I'm dead," she said. "She's still looking." People look for dead things, to confirm them, to have something to grieve over. It's not the same as believing. I didn't have a good answer to that. It was true as far as it went. "She was standing at the rail for 11 minutes, I said. "Just looking at the district, not checking a location, not covering a search area, just standing and looking." Sil was very still. "That's not a confirmation look," I said. "That's a hoping look." Another long silence. "My mother died 4 years ago," I said. "After she died, I kept setting 2 cups out for coffee in the morning, every morning for about a year, automatically, without thinking about it. I'd have the second cup on the counter before I remembered." I stopped, looked at the wall. "You don't stop believing in someone just because you're supposed to have. The belief is in your hands before it's in your head." Sil pressed her forehead to her knees. Her shoulders were very still with the effort of keeping them that way. "Her hands remember you," I said, "whatever her head has been told to accept." A long time of quiet. Then Sil lifted her face. Her eyes were very bright. The brightness that lives on the edge of things held back a long time. "Will you come with me?" she asked. "Yes." "She might not want a human there." "Probably not," I agreed. "I'll stay back." She looked at me. "I don't want you to stay back." "Sil." "I want you to walk in with me," she said, steady, very clear. So she knows someone kept me safe so she can see it. So she knows that the way I came back was like this, not some official recovery, not some, she stopped, found the right words, not some asset retrieved. Someone brought me home. She paused. And I want someone to walk in with me so I do not walk in alone. I looked at her, at the 6-year-old face carrying the weight of 3 years and expressing it with a precision that most adults couldn't manage. Okay, I said, I'll walk in with you. We went the next morning at the shift change, when the dock was busy enough that 2 more figures moving through it wouldn't draw particular notice. I wore the best clothes I owned. They were not impressive, but they were clean and they were mine. Sil wore her ruined garment. She'd been firm about it when I'd suggested she wear the newer things I'd bought her, and I understood once I thought about it from her angle. She wanted to be recognized, yes, but more than that she wanted what had happened to be visible. The state of that garment was testimony. She was going to walk in with the testimony on her back and let it speak before she said a word. She walked next to me through the transit district with the composure of someone considerably older, her chin level, her steps deliberate and even. I matched her pace. Around us the district moved in its ordinary way, cargo movers, transit workers, the smell of synth food stalls and recycled air, and the distant metallic undertone that transit districts always carry. Ordinary. All of it utterly ordinary and quietly extraordinary at the same time. The way ordinary things become when you're about to walk through a door that will change several lives. 2 Varathi crew members at the exterior access point. Both of them large, both of them alert with the particular alertness of people who have been briefed to notice everything. They moved to intercept us immediately. Private docking, said the one on the left in standard. This bay is restricted. Sil stepped forward 1 step ahead of me into the crew member's direct line of sight. He looked down at her. She looked up at him, had to tilt her head back considerably to do it with those teal eyes calm and level. And she spoke in Varathi. I had enough of the language by now to follow roughly, if not completely. What she said was, approximately, I know this bay is restricted. I am restricted along with it. I am the property of this house by blood and I am coming in. The crew member stared at her. His eyes moved. Her face, the ruined garment, the crest at the collar still visible despite everything, silver thread catching light, her face again. Something moved across his expression in a sequence I could track. Confusion, then recognition of the crest, then something it took him a moment to arrive at, and when he arrived at it his whole face changed. He said something urgent to his partner. The partner looked at Sil. The partner spoke into a communicator and then stood very still, waiting. We waited 3 minutes. I spent 3 minutes breathing carefully and looking at a point on the exterior access panel and thinking about nothing in particular and failing. Then the interior door opened. The Empress came through it already moving, the way people move when they've been told something, and their body responded before their thinking mind caught up. She was still in the plain coat. Her silver-white hair was pulled back, but several strands had come loose, and she hadn't fixed them, which told me she'd been awake for a while. She looked, if I'm being precise, like someone who had been awake for 3 years, and was managing to look like they'd only been awake for a few hours through the force of practiced discipline. She stopped when she saw Sil. Not slowed down, stopped. Mid-step, weight still forward, everything caught between 2 moments, her body fully committed to a motion that her mind had interrupted. Her face did something I am not equipped to describe and would not try to if I were. It was not an expression for an observer. I saw it for a second, and then I was looking at the floor. Sil stood very still. The composure she'd maintained on the walk through the district was still there, but it had changed character. It was no longer the composure of someone doing something hard alone. It was the composure of someone standing at the edge of something enormous and trying to stay steady long enough to say the one word they needed to say. "Mama," she said, in Varathi. The Empress crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and went down to her knees on the dock floor. Went down without apparent awareness that she was doing it, the way the body moves when the mind is somewhere else entirely, and gathered her daughter into her arms. Syl's arms went around her neck, and her face pressed into the silver-white hair, and the Empress made a sound. I will not try to describe that either. It is not mine to describe. I found a point on the upper access panel, and I studied it with absolute attention until my face was doing something I wasn't ashamed of. After a while, the sounds settled into the quieter register of things that have been needed a long time and are finally being allowed. After a while, the Empress looked up. She looked at me. I straightened. I didn't look away because looking away felt like a flinch, and a flinch felt wrong. I met her eyes directly, and I let her take whatever measure she needed to take. Her eyes were the same color as her daughter's, deeper, older, carrying things in them that Syl's hadn't accumulated yet, the particular specific weight of years of power and loss worn into the structure of a person's gaze. She looked at me, and she ran the same kind of assessment I'd watched Syl run on her first night on my couch, the full, careful kind rather than the surface kind. "You kept her," she said. Standard, precise, accented with the formality of someone who has used the language officially but not personally. "Yes," I said. "For how long?" 7 weeks. 7 weeks. She repeated it in a tone I couldn't entirely read. "She came to me," I said. "I didn't go looking. I found her on a transit platform. I took her home." "And then you waited." "I waited." "You didn't bring her to the authorities." "No." She held her daughter a fraction tighter for a moment. "Why not?" "Because whoever she was hiding from," I said, "was the reason she was hiding rather than going to the authorities herself. She was 6. She was surviving on her own. She wasn't hiding from transit security because she'd done something wrong. She was hiding because the official channels weren't safe. The last time someone in an official capacity told her to go with them because they were from the right people, they weren't." A silence. "So you waited," she said. "I waited until I could figure out who was looking and how, and whether the looking was safe. And then I brought her." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked down at Syl, who had leaned back enough to look up at her mother's face, and she said something in Varathi, and Syl answered, and they went back and forth in the soft, quick way of people who share a first language and haven't used it together in too long, the words spilling faster as they went, the cadence loosening from formal into something else. I waited. I was beginning to think I should quietly make my way toward the exit and let them have this without me standing here watching it, when Syl looked over at me and held out her hand. Her right hand, extended in my direction, with the calm expectation of a child who has decided something and is waiting for the world to catch up. I crossed the floor and took it. Her hand was small and cold. She always ran cold. And she held mine with the grip of someone who knows exactly how hard they need to hold to communicate what they mean. "This is the human," she said to her mother in English with what I recognized as the deliberate choice to say it in English so that I could follow. "He found me. He taught me words. He fixed machines and I handed him the tools and he always said thank you." She paused. "He never asked me who I was until I showed him. And when I showed him, he said we, and he meant it." She paused again. "I want you to know his face. Because I know his face and things I know, you should know too." The Empress looked at me. She looked at my hand around her daughter's. She looked at my face. "Your name," she said. "Marsh," I said, "just Marsh." "Marsh." She said it carefully, with the quality of attention that means someone is not just filing a name but filing the person the name belongs to. "I am Sevhariel, which is not just Sevhariel, but I find the parallel apt." I didn't know what to do with that. I said, "I'm glad she's safe." "Yes." Her voice was very even. "As am I." She looked at her daughter again, at the ruined garment, at the crest at the collar. Something moved across her face that was not public grief. It was more precise than that, more specific. The particular grief of seeing what was done to something you loved in your absence in detail for the first time. The people responsible for this, she said, and then she stopped. This is not a thing I will speak of in full here, but I will say as information, I will find them, all of them, whatever took however long. I assumed, I said. There will be questions, official ones, asked by people I send, about where she was found, what she said, what you observed. That's fine. She looked at me. You understand you are now connected to something that has implications. Yes. That is not a warning, she said. It is an orientation. The implications are not negative ones for you. But they are real ones. Syl was looking back and forth between us, with the expression of someone watching two complicated pieces determine whether they fit. Sevhariel, I said, and then stopped, because I realized that might have been wrong. She looked at me with something that might have been amusement, very contained. You may. Thank you, I said, for not asking me what I want, in advance. She looked at me steadily. I was going to ask. I know. I wanted to say whatever you're going to offer, I didn't do this for a return. I want that on the record first. It is on the record, she said. Now I'm going to ask anyway. She let a beat pass. What do you want, Marsh, for what you have done? I looked at Syl, who was looking at me, whose small hand was still in mine. I wanted her to be somewhere safe, I said, and good and where she belongs. I looked at Sevhariel. She is. That is not compensation. No, it's not, but it's what I wanted. Then I'll ask differently, she said. What do you need? I thought about that. My apartment, the maintenance bay, Bay 12's coolant feeds, my one room and my 4 blankets and my cracked knuckles and the coffee that was my luxury. I'm okay, I said. She looked at me with an expression that suggested she found this answer both credible and insufficient. There is a Varathi technical exchange program, she said, operating through the diplomatic quarter, engineers and maintenance specialists, skilled work, significant compensation, full diplomatic protections while operating. A pause. And it requires someone who knows how to be careful and how to keep things safe, without being told which things, without being given the full picture, acting on what they can observe and what they have reason to trust. That sounds like a specialized position, I said. It is. It was not filled before now because the right qualifications are not technical ones. Syl squeezed my hand. I looked down at her. Say yes, she said. I'm still thinking. You are not. Your face does the thing. My face doesn't do a thing. It does. It did it with the sandwich. You had already decided. You were just waiting for me to be ready. I looked at her. She looked back at me with the absolute certainty of someone who has observed a person carefully for 7 weeks and trusts what they've seen. Sevhariel looked at me. The expression on her face had arrived somewhere now. It had been traveling toward something since she first looked at me over her daughter's head, and it was there now. Larger than gratitude, quieter, the kind of thing that exists below the register of expressions but shapes them all. She is, the Empress said, not wrong. I stood there with Syl's small cold hand in mine, and I thought about the sandwich on the ground and 11 seconds and 4 blankets and tool handles and language lessons, and a coffee mug with a chip in it, and all of it so ordinary that I hadn't noticed what it was while I was in it. Okay, I said. Okay, yes, Syl said. Okay, yes. She nodded once. The nod of a 6-year-old who has successfully managed something she needed to manage and knows it. 2 days later, the Varathi ship filed a departure manifest. I was on it. I went back to my apartment to clear it out. It didn't take long. I had lived in a way that didn't accumulate much, not because I was disciplined about it, but because most things that came through my life passed through it rather than staying. The tools, the tablets, the photograph, the coffee mug with the chip in the handle, the blanket from the couch. I left the key with a note on the manager's counter that said, "Available," and I meant it as information rather than sentiment, but it felt like both. On the way to the dock, I stopped at platform 9. Just stopped. Stood in the transit current moving around me and looked at the waste compactor and the narrow gap between it and the outer depot wall. The morning shift was starting and the platform had its usual noise: cargo loaders, transit announcements, the smell of synth grain from the food stall on the corner. I thought about a small shape in the dark, and a synth grain bar held in two careful hands, and the freeze of something that didn't know yet whether it was safe. I thought about 11 seconds. I walked to the dock. Syl was waiting at the access point. New clothes Varatha made, properly fitted deep blue that made her eyes look like lit water. She looked rested and clean and herself, which was continuous with how she'd always looked but had room now to be more fully what it was. A plant given water and light. The self that had been there all along, more visible now. She looked at my bag. "That's everything," she said. "Pretty much." A pause, then she reached out and took the strap. "I'll carry it," she said. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, in the tone she'd used when she said she didn't want to walk in alone. I let her take it. The bag was almost as tall as she was. She carried it with the focused determination of someone who has decided to do a thing and is not going to let the difficulty of the thing change the decision. I didn't offer to help. I walked next to her down the access corridor, and the dock lights fell away behind us, and ahead was the ship and whatever came with it. Sevhariel was at the operations level, talking to the crew lead, but she looked over when we came through, and something moved briefly across her face when she saw us, something that was not an official expression, before she turned back to the crew lead. We walked the length of the corridor, and at the end of it Syl put down the bag and looked up at me. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the sandwich, not for the couch and the blankets and the language lessons and the tools and the 7 weeks, not for any specific thing. Just thank you, flat and full and clear, the way you say something when you mean all of it at once, and you trust the person to understand the scope." "You're welcome," I said. She picked the bag back up. We walked forward. The ship closed behind us. Outside, through the forward ports, the dark between stars looked the same as it always looks: absolute, and full of things we haven't found yet. Ahead of us somewhere, whatever home means when you've been away from it long enough that coming back to it is also something new. Whatever the next thing is when the current thing is done. I thought about 7 weeks, and what they'd contained, and how little I'd planned any of it, and how much it had turned out to matter. I thought about how lives go, how the significant moments almost never announce themselves, how the sandwich on the ground in the dark was never going to look like a hinge point until it already was one. Syl walked next to me with my bag over her shoulder. Sevhariel's voice carried from the operations level, steady and precise. The crew moved around us efficiently. The stars waited. We walked forward. 3 weeks into the journey, I had become what the ship called, in translated standard, a technical associate, which was a title I hadn't asked for, and that Sevhariel had apparently assigned without announcement. I found out when the crew lead handed me a data tablet with my responsibilities outlined on it, and a security clearance that extended to the maintenance and engineering systems of the ship. And I stood there in the corridor reading it, and thinking about Bay 12's coolant feeds, and the apartment I'd handed back, and how thoroughly my life had reorganized itself around a sandwich. The ship systems were different from what I was used to. Varathi engineering has a different logic at its base, a different theory of how components should relate to each other, a preference for redundancy structures I wouldn't have designed, and that I came to understand, over those 3 weeks, were more elegant than my first impression suggested. I spent the first 10 days just mapping them, reading the schematics, running the diagnostics, learning the language of the machine before I tried to say anything to it. Sil sat with me in the engineering section sometimes, doing her own reading on a tablet. She was back in lessons now, formal ones with a tutor on the ship, though she still came to find me in the evenings and we still did our informal back and forth, her correcting my Varathi, me catching the gaps in her English. And occasionally she would look up from her tablet and say, in the tone of someone helpfully pointing out an obvious thing, "That relay is connected to the secondary cooling loop, not the primary. You were reading it as primary." I looked at the relay, looked at the schematic, looked at her. "How do you know that?" I said. "I read the whole schematic," she said, returning to her tablet, "on the first day." I went back to the relay. She was right. I did not say this out loud with any particular expressiveness, but I filed it, along with the calibration wrench, along with a growing catalog of evidence that the person I had been teaching things to had been teaching me things back, more quietly, for the whole 7 weeks. I had my first formal conversation with Sevhariel on the 12th day, not the operational ones we'd had about the technical systems, or the brief exchanges over logistics. A real conversation, which happened in the small observation room off the operations level in the early ship cycle morning, when neither of us was supposed to be awake. She was there when I arrived, standing at the observation port, the same position I'd seen her in on the dock, looking out at what was outside, in the steady way of someone for whom looking is a form of thinking. I stopped in the doorway. "Sit down, Marsh," she said, without turning from the port. I sat. After a moment she sat too, across from me, and she had a cup of something that steamed, and she held it the way I held my coffee, in both hands, not drinking it, just having it there. I noticed this because it is one of the things you notice about people after a certain amount of time, the small physical habits, the gestures that belong to comfort rather than intention. "The investigation is proceeding," she said. "Into who took her?" "Yes, I have people who have been working on it for 3 years. What she's been able to tell us has filled in the remaining gaps." A pause. "It will be resolved." "I believe you," I said. She looked at me. "You do?" "Yes." Most people do not believe me that directly. They agree, it's different. "I've watched you for 3 weeks," I said. "You resolve things, it's what your brain does. I don't have any particular reason to doubt it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What were you doing before, in the maintenance district?" "Fixing things," I said. "Bay maintenance, system management. I've done it for 7 years in that district and 8 years before that in a cargo hub on the Meridian line." "You've been in the transit infrastructure for 15 years. "I like how systems work," I said. "I like how they connect to each other. I like finding the fault and understanding why it's a fault and fixing it so it isn't one anymore." She considered this. "Sil says you always explained what you were fixing and why." "She was watching," I said. "It would have been rude not to." "Most people don't think of it that way." "Most people aren't being watched that carefully," I said. She was paying very close attention, from the first day. It would have been wasteful not to include her in what I was doing. Sevhariel looked at her cup, at the stars through the observation port. Something in her expression that I was beginning to learn was not quite sadness and not quite something else. The particular quality of a parent who has heard what her child experienced in her absence and is living with what it means that the child not only survived but formed opinions and paid close attention and learned how to hand tools to someone who was fixing things. "She told me," Sevhariel said, "that when she had nightmares you didn't ask about them. You made tea." "Tea was something she'd told me she liked," I said. "Early on, when we were still mostly working on vocabulary, she said there was something like it at home, something warm and not quite sweet." "There is," Sevhariel said. "It's called," she said a word in Varathi that I caught the shape of but not the full sound. "I'll practice that," I said. She looked at me. "You're still learning the language." "Yes, I'm not very good yet." "Sil says you're better than you think." Sil has a vested interest in my progress because she's the one teaching me, and she takes the quality of her teaching personally. Sevhariel made a sound. It took me a moment to identify it as a laugh, not a large one, not a performed one, a real one, the kind that escapes rather than being produced. She looked surprised by it and then looked away, and after a moment she looked back with something lighter in her face than had been there before. She does, Sevhariel said. Yes. We sat in the observation room for another hour, not always talking. Sometimes just sitting with the stars outside and the quiet hum of the ship around us, and the particular kind of company that doesn't need to fill itself in to be worth having. At some point she made more of the steaming drink. She had the ingredients with her, which meant she came here regularly, which meant this was her version of the maintenance bay's corner, the place she went to think. And she made a second cup and set it in front of me, and I tried it, and it was not coffee, but it was good in a different way. Something with warmth and depth and a slight bitterness that resolved into something almost sweet. This is the thing Sil mentioned, I said. Yes. I held the cup in both hands. She said it tasted like home. Sevhariel was quiet. I'm glad she had something to miss, I said. Having something to miss means there's something to go back to. It kept her oriented. Sevhariel set her cup down. Her hand stayed around it. When the record was filed, she said. The memorial, she stopped. I did not believe it. I want you to know that. I ordered the official record because the court required something and because not having something official felt like the wrong kind of hope, the kind that prevents you from functioning. But I didn't believe it. I know, I said. You couldn't have known. You were standing at a dock rail on Platform 9's upper level for 11 minutes in a plain coat, I said, looking at a transit district. That's not what belief in a memorial looks like. She was quiet for a long time. No, she said, it isn't. We sat there until the ship cycle morning deepened toward the operating hours, and other crew members began moving through the corridors outside. When we stood to go, Sevhariel paused at the doorway. Marsh, she said. Yeah. The technical position, the exchange program. She looked at me steadily. It is real work. I want to be clear about that. I'm not offering you a sinecure. I know, I said. You don't do ceremonial. No, a pause. But I am also offering it because she trusts you, and she doesn't trust easily, and I have learned to pay attention to what she trusts. Another pause. My daughter has very good judgment about things that matter. Yes, I said. She does. Sevhariel looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded once, the same gravity Sil used when she'd made a decision and was finished making it. I recognized the gesture. I supposed I should have expected to. She left. I stood in the observation room for a minute more, looking at the stars through the port. Then I went to find Sil, because she'd asked me the previous evening to help her with the section of her Varathi coursework that covered the mathematical conventions for astronomical navigation. And she had said, with her compressed professional patience, "We will do it in the morning, because by evening your brain makes mistakes that you do not catch until I point them out, and then you are embarrassed, and you spend too much time on the embarrassment." She was not wrong about that either. I went to find her, and she was already in the small study room with her tablet and a cup of the not-quite-sweet drink and a second cup set out for me. The way you set something out for someone without thinking about it because they have become part of the expected shape of things. And I sat down across from her, and she slid the tablet across to me, and we got to work.